My wife of 17 years handed me a coffee mug that morning, not divorce papers. "No divorce papers needed," she said, smirking like she just won a game I didn't know we were playing. "Just leave." Behind her, in the doorway of the home I'd paid off 2 years early, stood a man carrying a duffel bag into my bedroom like he already owned the closet space. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just nodded, walked upstairs, and started packing. What Camille didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I wasn't just her husband. And when her phone rang the next morning with a Washington, D.C. area code, she was about to find out exactly who she'd told to leave. My name is Donovan Marsh. I'm 46 years old, and for the last 19 years I've worked a job that doesn't exist on paper the way most jobs do. On my driver's license, on my tax returns, on the forms I fill out at the pediatrician's office for my kids, I'm listed as a logistics consultant for a shipping compliance firm based out of Norfolk, Virginia. That's not a lie exactly. It's a cover, and a good one, because covers have to survive dinner parties and PTA meetings and every nosy neighbor who's ever asked what I do for a living. The truth is, I've spent nearly 2 decades working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, most of that time embedded deep in financial crimes and counterintelligence work that required me to be, for all practical purposes, invisible. My own wife didn't know the full extent of it. That was by design. That was the job. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and if there's one thing 19 years in federal law enforcement teaches you, it's patience. So let me back up and tell you how a man builds a life for 17 years, only to watch his wife hand it to another man like a set of house keys. Camille and I met in Richmond, Virginia, back when I was 27, and working what she believed was an entry-level compliance position for a maritime shipping company. She was 25, finishing up her degree in interior design at VCU, working part-time at a boutique furniture store on West Broad Street. She had this laugh that carried across a room, the kind of laugh that made strangers turn around and smile without knowing why. I walked into that furniture store looking for a bookshelf and walked out 3 weeks later asking her to dinner. That's the short version. The long version involves me lying about my actual job function for the first 6 months we dated, which sounds bad until you understand that federal agents doing undercover adjacent work are required to maintain cover even in their personal lives, especially in the early years when a relationship could compromise an active case. By the time I told her the truth, 3 months before I proposed, she'd already fallen in love with the cover story version of me. When I finally sat her down in my apartment on Hull Street and told her what I actually did, she cried. Not out of fear, she told me later, but out of relief, because she said she always sensed there was something I was holding back, and she thought it meant I didn't trust her. I told her the truth that night, because I wanted to marry her, and you don't marry someone while lying about the fundamental architecture of your life. She kept the secret. She had to. Spouses of agents in sensitive positions sign non-disclosure agreements just like we do, and Camille signed hers without hesitation, sitting across from my supervisor at the time, a stern but fair woman named Deborah Castellano, who explained exactly what silence would cost her if she ever broke it. We got married on a Saturday in October, 17 years ago, at a small vineyard outside Charlottesville. My mother cried through the entire ceremony. My father, a retired Marine who'd spent 30 years teaching me that a man's word is the only currency that actually matters, shook my hand afterward and told me I'd done well. Camille's parents, Walter and Denise Ashford, ran a small accounting firm in Fredericksburg, and they toasted us with a speech about building something that lasts. I believed every word of that speech. I still do, actually. I just didn't know that Camille wouldn't be the one building it with me for the whole ride. For the first 10 years, everything was exactly what it looked like from the outside. We bought a colonial-style house in a quiet subdivision outside Fredericksburg, close enough to her parents that Denise could drop by unannounced, which she did more often than either Camille or I would have liked. We had 2 kids. Our daughter, Harper, is 15 now, sharp as a tack, plays varsity volleyball, and has never once suspected that her father's actual job involves things that would frighten most adults. Our son, Beckett, is 12, obsessed with building computers from parts he finds on eBay, a kid who asks more questions in a single dinner conversation than most federal interrogators ask in a week. I coached Beckett's Little League team for 4 seasons. I drove Harper to volleyball tournaments 3 states away, I was, by every visible measure, an ordinary suburban father who happened to travel for work more than most. That travel, of course, was the job. Weeks in Miami tracking financial networks tied to organized fraud rings. Months in Charlotte working alongside a joint task force investigating shell companies, laundering money through real estate. A 6-month stretch 2 years ago that took me to 3 different cities I still can't name in detail. Working a case that eventually led to 14 federal indictments. Camille knew the shape of what I did without ever knowing the specifics, and for over a decade, that arrangement worked. She understood that some nights I couldn't answer the phone. She understood that some trips I couldn't discuss. She understood, or at least I thought she did, that the silences in our marriage weren't emptiness. They were the shape of trust. Looking back now, I can see the exact season things started to shift, though at the time I was too buried in a case out of Baltimore to notice the cracks forming under my own roof. It was about 2 years ago, right around the time Camille started her new job as a regional sales director for a home staging and design company called Bellwether Interiors. The job took her into other people's houses, other people's lives, and eventually, though I didn't know it yet, into the orbit of a man named Trent Kowalski. Trent was 34 years old, ran his own real estate investment company out of an office in Stafford County, and had the kind of easy, tanned confidence that comes from a man who's never had to explain an absence to anyone. He drove a lifted black F-150 with dealer plates that never seemed to expire into permanent registration, the kind of vehicle that says I make good money and I want you to notice. Camille met him through a staging job on a property he was flipping in Spotsylvania County. I know this because eventually, once things had already gone sideways, I pulled the timeline together the way I pulled together every timeline. Slowly, methodically, with sources. The signs, when I look back, were the same tired signs every man in my position has heard about 1,000 times, but never expects to actually live through. Camille started going to a new gym, a boutique spin studio 25 minutes from our house when there was a perfectly good gym 8 minutes away. She started dressing differently for her open houses. Nothing dramatic, just enough that Denise, her own mother, commented on it at a family dinner. She started keeping her phone face down on the kitchen counter, a woman who for 15 years had left her phone lying around unlocked without a second thought. I noticed. Of course I noticed. 20 years of federal investigative work doesn't turn off when you walk through your own front door. But here's the part that I think surprises people when I explain it. I didn't confront her right away, and it wasn't because I was in denial. It was because I know, better than almost anyone, that the moment you tip your hand in an investigation, you lose your ability to see the whole picture. And some small, cold part of me, the part that had spent 2 decades building cases brick by brick, treated my own marriage the exact same way I'd treat a target. I watched, I gathered, I waited. It took me 4 months to build a complete picture, and I want to be honest with you about something. Those 4 months were the loneliest of my entire life, lonelier than any undercover assignment, lonelier than any 6-month stretch away from my kids. Because during those 4 months, I still made her coffee every morning. I still kissed her goodbye. I still sat across from her at dinner and asked about her day, and she told me stories about clients and staging projects that I now knew, thanks to a discreet look at her business calendar during a weekend when the kids were at my parents' house, were half true at best. The confirmation came on a Tuesday in March. I'd told Camille I was flying to Atlanta for a 3-day consulting trip, which was, for once, actually true, since I was closing out a financial crimes case that had eaten most of my year. What Camille didn't know was that my flight back landed 6 hours earlier than I told her, a small operational habit I'd carried over from the job without even thinking about it. Old instincts. Never announce your actual arrival time if you don't have to. I pulled into our driveway in Fredericksburg just after 2 in the afternoon and found Trent Kowalski's black F-150 parked in my spot in the garage, and Camille's Lexus pulled halfway onto the lawn like she'd left in a hurry that morning without thinking about where she parked. I sat in my car for a long moment, the way I'd sat outside 100 surveillance targets over the years, and I felt something I can only describe as a strange, clinical calm settle over me. Not rage. Not yet. Just the same steady focus I bring to any confirmed threat. I didn't go inside that day. I want to be clear about that, because I know some people listening to this will wonder why a man wouldn't storm through his own front door in that moment. But I've spent my career learning that the worst thing you can do when you finally have confirmation is act on emotion before you understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. So I backed out of the driveway, drove to a coffee shop on Caroline Street, and sat there for 2 hours, doing something I'm not proud of, but don't regret. I started building a file on my own wife. Over the following 6 weeks, I did what I do for a living. I pulled together financial records, which as her husband I had every legal right to access. I found charges at a boutique hotel in Stafford, 4 separate weekends over 5 months, always booked under Camille's name, always paid with a credit card she thought I didn't know about because she'd opened it 8 months earlier and had the statement sent to a P.O. box registered to Bellwether Interior's address, thinking that was clever. It wasn't. I found Trent Kowalski's full financial and business history, which, and this is the part that would matter enormously later, revealed something Camille clearly had no idea about. Trent's real estate investment company, the one funding the truck and the tailored shirts and the confidence, was under active investigation by the Virginia State Corporation Commission for what looked like a classic real estate fraud scheme, flipping properties using fraudulent appraisals and straw buyers to inflate loan values, then defaulting and walking away with the difference. It was small time compared to cases I'd worked, but it was real, and it was federal adjacent enough that I flagged it to a colleague in the Richmond field office almost as a professional courtesy, without mentioning why I happened to know Trent Kowalski's name in the first place. I didn't confront Camille. I kept coaching Beckett's baseball games. I kept driving Harper to tournaments. I kept sleeping in the same bed as a woman who was, some nights, texting another man 3 feet away from me while I pretended to read case files on my laptop. People ask me now how I manage that, how a man keeps his composure while his marriage quietly disintegrates around him. And the honest answer is that composure is the only skill I've spent 2 decades perfecting. It's not that I didn't feel it. I felt every bit of it. I just didn't let it control what I did next. The morning it finally broke open wasn't a morning I chose. It was a morning Camille chose, and I think that detail matters because it tells you something about who she'd become over those months. It was a Thursday. I was in the kitchen making coffee, the same routine I'd followed for 17 years, when Camille walked downstairs already dressed, hair done, makeup done, at 7 in the morning on a day she had no open houses scheduled. Behind her came Trent Kowalski, carrying a duffel bag, walking through my front hallway like he'd walked it 100 times before, which, I would later learn, he had. "Donovan," Camille said, and there was no shake in her voice at all. None of the nervousness I might have expected from a woman about to blow up her own family. "I think it's time we're honest with each other." I set down my coffee mug and waited, because that's what you do. You let the other party talk first. You let them tell you what they think they know. "I've been seeing Trent for a while now," she said, gesturing slightly toward him, like she was introducing a colleague at a work function, "and I want a divorce. I want to tell you I felt my chest cave in, and in a way I did, but what I said out loud was simply, okay." That single word seemed to throw her more than I expected. She'd clearly rehearsed for tears, for anger, for some version of me falling apart in front of her and her new boyfriend, and instead she got a man who'd spent 4 months already grieving a marriage she thought she was only just now ending. "No divorce papers needed," she said then, and this is the line that's stuck with me every single day since, the line I'll remember until I die, because of the way she smiled when she said it. Not a nervous smile, a satisfied one. "Just leave, Donovan. This is my house now." I looked at Trent, standing there in my hallway holding his duffel bag like he was moving into a dorm room. And I looked at Camille, standing in the kitchen we'd renovated together 5 years earlier. The kitchen where I'd taught Beckett to make pancakes. The kitchen where Harper had done her homework every night since kindergarten. And I said, "All right." Then I walked upstairs, packed 2 suitcases with the same methodical efficiency I bring to a field assignment, and left. I didn't argue about the house. I didn't argue about anything, and I could see in Camille's face, right as I was walking out the front door, that my silence unsettled her far more than screaming ever would have. People who are braced for a fight don't know what to do when the fight doesn't come. I got in my car, drove to a Hampton Inn off Route 3, checked into a room, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. But here's the thing Camille didn't understand. The thing that no amount of watching true crime shows or reading divorce forms had prepared her for. She'd told a federal agent to leave his own house without a fight, and she had absolutely no idea that the man she just humiliated in front of her boyfriend had spent the last 6 weeks quietly compiling a file on the very same boyfriend that was about to detonate his entire life. That evening, from my hotel room, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priscilla Vance, who'd handled estate and family matters for federal employees for over a decade, and who I'd retained quietly 2 months earlier, right around the time I confirmed the affair, because I am, if nothing else, a man who prepares. The second call was to a colleague I've known since Quantico, a supervisory special agent named Reginald Okafor, who now worked white-collar crime out of the Richmond field office, the very colleague I'd casually flagged Trent Kowalski's name to weeks earlier without explaining the personal connection. "Reggie," I said when he picked up, "that name I gave you a few weeks back. Kowalski. Where's that case at?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me Reggie already suspected there was more to my interest than professional courtesy. "Funny you ask," he said. "We've been building on it for about 2 months now. State's been looking at him for the appraisal fraud, but once we pulled the thread, it goes further than that. Wire fraud across state lines, at least 3 victims we've confirmed. Probably more. We were planning to move on him within the next few weeks anyway." I told Reggie everything then. Not because I needed to. The investigation didn't actually require my personal history with Camille or Trent, but because 19 years of training told me that withholding a material conflict of interest from a colleague working a case adjacent to my own life was exactly the kind of thing that gets careers ended and cases thrown out. Reggie listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Donovan," he finally said, "I'm sorry, man. That's rough." Then, after another pause, "You know this doesn't change the timeline of the investigation. We were already moving on him." "I know," I said. "I'm not asking you to change anything. I'm telling you because you need to know, and because I want to make sure nothing about this looks like I used my position to go after the guy who slept with my wife." Reggie laughed, not unkindly. "For what it's worth, the guy was going to get indicted with or without you in the picture. You just happened to marry into the middle of an active federal case. That's the part of this story that even I have trouble believing sometimes, even though I lived every second of it. Trent Kowalski wasn't just some personal trainer or gym rat who'd charmed my wife with a nice truck and a confident smile. He was, unbeknownst to Camille, the target of an active multi-state wire fraud investigation that had been building for months before he ever set foot in my house. Camille had fallen for a man who was, by any legal definition, a criminal already in the crosshairs of the federal government, and she had absolutely no idea because Trent had built the exact same kind of cover story with her that men like him always build. Successful investor, self-made, a man escaping a difficult divorce of his own, he'd told her, when in reality Trent had never been married at all, a detail Camille would only learn later, and far too late to matter. I spent that night in the Hampton Inn doing something I hadn't let myself do in the 6 weeks since I'd confirmed everything. I let myself feel it. Not the anger, not yet, but the grief. 17 years is a long time to build something with a person, and even knowing what I knew, even having spent weeks preparing for exactly this outcome, there's a particular kind of hollow that comes from watching someone you loved for most of your adult life smile while she tells you to leave your own home. I called my father that night, the retired Marine, and told him what happened. He didn't say much. He never does. But he told me one thing that stuck with me. A man who prepares for the storm doesn't drown in it. He just gets wet for a while. That's about as close to poetry as my father gets, and it was exactly what I needed to hear. The next morning, a Friday, I drove to Harper and Beckett's school before first period, something I almost never do, and I sat with each of them separately for 10 minutes in the front office conference room the guidance counselor let me use. I told them, as gently and honestly as I could manage, that their mother and I were getting a divorce, and that whatever happened next, nothing about how much I loved them was changing. Harper cried. Beckett asked a series of very practical 12-year-old questions about where he was going to sleep and whether he'd still get to keep his computer set up. which somehow made me laugh for the first time in weeks. I told them I'd found a place nearby, which by that point I had, a 2-bedroom rental about 15 minutes from their school, because whatever else happened, I was not going to become a father who disappeared from his kids' daily lives. That Friday afternoon, while I was signing the lease on the rental, Priscilla Vance called me with an update. "I've filed the initial paperwork," she said. "Given the financial disclosures you've provided, and given what you've told me about the property, I think you're in a much stronger position than Camille realizes." The house, it turned out, mattered more than Camille understood, because 3 years earlier, when interest rates dipped, I'd used a modest inheritance from my grandmother to pay off the remaining balance of our mortgage entirely. A fact Camille was present for, but had apparently never fully processed the legal implications of. Under Virginia law, and given the specific way the property and the payoff had been structured, along with a post-nuptial financial agreement we'd signed years earlier, during a period when Camille herself had insisted on protecting both our individual premarital assets, after watching her own parents go through a messy business dispute, the house was not nearly as simply hers as she seemed to believe standing in that kitchen. But the house was, frankly, the least interesting part of what happened next. Saturday morning, less than 48 hours after Camille told me to leave, I was sitting in my new rental drinking coffee out of a paper cup because I hadn't unpacked the kitchen boxes yet, when my phone buzzed with a text from Denise, Camille's mother. "Have you talked to Camille today?" it read. "Something's happening at the house. She's not making sense." I hadn't talked to Camille, and I wasn't planning to, not directly, not yet. Everything from that point forward was going through Priscilla. But curiosity, or maybe something closer to inevitability, made me call Reggie instead. "We executed the warrant this morning," Reggie told me, and I could hear the low hum of activity behind him. Radio chatter, doors, the particular controlled chaos of a coordinated federal action. Kowalski's office in Stafford, his residence, and one other address that came up during surveillance. There was a brief pause. "Your old address, Donovan." He'd apparently been keeping some of his business files and a laptop there. I sat there in my mostly unpacked rental, holding a paper coffee cup that had gone cold, and let that land. Camille had let Trent move his duffel bag into my house on Thursday morning, smiling as she told me to leave. And on Saturday morning, less than 48 hours later, that same house had federal agents inside it, executing a search warrant connected to a multi-state wire fraud investigation, because Trent Kowalski, the man she'd chosen over 17 years of marriage, had apparently decided my former home was a convenient place to stash evidence he didn't want found in his own office. Reggie called me again that evening, after everything had settled, and gave me the fuller picture, the parts that weren't classified, the parts I was entitled to know both as a colleague and, frankly, as a man whose life had been dragged into the middle of it. Trent Kowalski's investment company had defrauded at least 6 victims across Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, using falsified property appraisals to secure loans far larger than the properties were actually worth, then defaulting and pocketing the difference through a network of shell LLCs. Total losses were estimated at just under $2.3 million. He was facing charges that could put him away for a decade or more. And Camille, standing in the kitchen of a house that federal agents were now combing through with warrants and evidence bags, was, for the first time since she'd met him at that flip property in Spotsylvania County, forced to confront the fact that the confident, tanned, F-150 driving man she'd blown up her marriage for wasn't actually the successful investor he'd presented himself as. He was, according to the arrest report I read 3 days later, a man who'd been running the same basic con for almost 4 years, moving from one relationship to the next, always finding a woman with a stable home and a trusting nature to serve as a soft landing spot between schemes. Camille called me Sunday night. I almost didn't answer, but 17 years of marriage doesn't fully disappear the moment someone tells you to leave, and some old instinct made me pick up. She was crying, the real kind, not performance, and she asked me if I'd known. I told her the truth, which was that I'd flagged his name to federal investigators weeks earlier because his financial history had crossed my desk during an entirely separate professional review, and that I had no idea and no reason to believe that she was involved with him at that specific time, since I only confirmed the affair itself well after his name had already been on investigators' radar. That was, and remains, entirely true. I never used my position to target Trent Kowalski because he was sleeping with my wife. I used my position, as I'm required to flag a suspected criminal to the appropriate authorities. The fact that those two threads happened to be tangled together was not something I engineered. It was something I discovered. Camille didn't fully believe me at first, and honestly, I understood why. It's a strange thing to be told that the man you humiliated in his own kitchen just happened to already be quietly connected to the downfall of the man you left him for. But over the following weeks, as the case against Trent developed, and as Camille was forced to sit through her own interview with federal investigators, not as a suspect, she'd had no knowledge of or involvement in his fraud, but as a witness who'd unknowingly provided him a place to hide evidence, the full shape of what had actually happened settled over her. The house situation resolved itself in a way that surprised even Priscilla, who told me she'd rarely seen a divorce settlement move so quickly once both financial and legal realities became clear. Camille, facing the very real possibility of being pulled deeper into a federal investigation simply by association, and facing the fact that the post-nuptial agreement protected the equity I'd built into the property, agreed to a settlement that gave me the house outright, along with primary physical custody of Harper and Beckett, while she retained her retirement accounts and a fair division of the remaining marital assets. It wasn't vindictive. I made sure of that. I've spent my career believing in proportionality, in making sure consequences match actions rather than emotions, and I wasn't interested in destroying Camille financially out of spite. I was interested in making sure my kids had stability, and that the home they'd grown up in remained theirs. 6 months have passed since that Thursday morning in the kitchen. Trent Kowalski pleaded guilty to reduced federal charges in exchange for cooperation against 2 associates who'd helped him falsify the appraisals, and he's currently serving a 4-year sentence at a federal facility in North Carolina. Camille moved into a townhouse about 20 minutes from Harper and Beckett's school, close enough that custody exchanges are easy, far enough that we're not constantly running into each other at the grocery store. We're civil now, more civil than I expected to be capable of, honestly. She's in therapy, which she told me about herself, unprompted, during a custody handoff a few months back. And I believe she means it when she says she's trying to understand why she made the choices she made. I moved back into the house Camille told me to leave. The same kitchen, the same hallway Trent walked through with his duffel bag like he owned it. Harper's back in her old room. Beckett's rebuilt his computer setup on the same desk. Some nights I still stand in that kitchen making coffee and think about the exact moment Camille smiled and told me no divorce papers were needed. And I think about how close she came to being right. Not because she'd have gotten away with anything, but because for about 48 hours, she genuinely believed she'd won. People ask me sometimes, colleagues mostly, whether I regret not confronting her the moment I found out, whether I wish I'd screamed or thrown something or done any of the things people expect a betrayed husband to do. I don't. 19 years of federal work taught me that the people who lose in the end are almost always the ones who acted first and understood second. Camille acted first. She smiled in that kitchen because she thought she understood the whole picture, and she didn't. She thought she was ending a marriage to a mid-level logistics consultant who'd roll over quietly. What she actually did was tell a federal agent to leave his own house, 2 days before that agent's colleagues walked through her new boyfriend's front door with a warrant. I think about Reggie's words sometimes, that Trent was going to be indicted regardless of me. That's true, and I hold on to that truth, because I never wanted to be the kind of man who used his badge as a weapon in his own marriage. I didn't need to. The truth did the work on its own. It always does, eventually, if you're patient enough to let it. Harper asked me a few weeks ago, during one of our drives to a volleyball tournament, whether I was happy. It's the kind of question 15-year-olds ask when they're trying to understand whether the adults around them are actually okay, or just performing okay for the kids' sake. I told her the truth, the same way I've tried to tell her the truth about most things since that Thursday morning. I told her that happiness wasn't really the word for it yet, that I was still working through what it meant to rebuild a life at 46 after 17 years, but that I was steady. I was solid. And steady, I told her, is usually the thing that happiness gets built on top of, if you give it enough time. Camille never did send those divorce papers, in the end. She didn't need to. I filed them myself, 3 days after that Thursday morning, through Priscilla Vance, quietly and efficiently, the same way I've handled every difficult thing in my professional life. No papers needed, she'd told me, standing in my kitchen with a smile on her face. She was almost right. She just never imagined how quickly the ground beneath her would shift, or how little control she actually had over an ending she thought she'd already written. You know, I keep coming back to this idea whenever I write these stories. The calmest person in the room is usually the one who's already 3 steps ahead. Donovan didn't win because he yelled louder or fought harder. He won because he waited, he watched, and he let the truth do the work for him. And honestly, I think a lot of us could use that reminder. You don't always have to react in the moment. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is just stay quiet and let things play out. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Would you have handled it the same way Donovan did? And if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because I've got a lot more stories like this one coming your way.